I want to tell everyone that we are talking with, or I am talking with, Robin Ligon-Eaton. And the book that she has come out with is Rhythm, Ritual, and Resistance, Africa is Alive in the Black Indians of New Orleans. Robin, this topic is just so incredibly fascinating for me. Well, I'm also a writer, so I write quite a bit about Southern history and also African history. But bringing in the music side of this is just so fascinating to me. So what I'd like to be able to do, actually, is to go through this listing of terms. It's a glossary of terms she has in her book, which just explains so much. And I know what I said to you earlier, not on the air, but as I said to Robin when she came into the studio this evening, by going through these terms, it explains so much, but I'm sure that if we're having a lengthy discussion about this, which we will do somewhat tonight, but I want you to come back again and we'll have
Thank you.
more of a dialogue about all this, that these terms will come up consistently. So let's talk about them.
Okay.
The first term that you have here is Mardi Gras and Black Indian, you say. So what does that mean exactly?
So the reason that initially they were called Mardi Gras Indians, which is not what they like to be called now, they want to be called Black Masking Indians. And I think there's been a shift in the sensibility, the consciousness of the Black Masking Indians themselves. The reason Mardi Gras Indian was the term was because blacks were not allowed to be part of Mardi Gras. So Mardi Gras, as you know or may not know, was a European tradition, okay? And so there was sort of a theatrical version of this played out in early Mardi Gras celebrations in New Orleans, back in the early 1800s. And so you had kings and queens and crews and societies and all of these things. And it was also very political and very much a reflection of the class system in New Orleans. And it was largely European, and the themes were, interestingly enough, from Greek and Roman myth. So you saw all that going on, but blacks were not allowed to be a part of it until the crew of Zulu came up in the very late 1800s. There was the first black
until the what came out?
The crew of Zulu was the first black carnival organization.
I see. Okay.
But on the streets of New Orleans, we saw people actually masking Indian, and people didn't know where that was coming from. And so people think that came from the Wild West, Buffalo Bill Wild West show. And I say, no. It came much beyond that, because when slaves were brought, largely of Senegambian descent, they came from the Senegambian region, in the early 1700s, the Chitimacha Indians in New Orleans, in that part of Louisiana, were the most enslaved people at that point. But when the slaves were brought from Africa, a lot of the African slaves would mask Indian in order to escape, to get up the bayous on a pirogue, on a boat or whatever, going up the bayou to escape. They would mask as an Indian in order to escape.
Yeah, interesting.
So, and then there were a lot of tribes that took them in. The Natchez took in 400 slaves. Natchez, which was further up in Mississippi, but right on the edge, of the border there. And, they ended up overturning forts and all kinds of things because, quite frankly, I believe that African slaves saw something, they saw so many similarities, and there was so many things that resonated with them within the other culture. And so
within the Indian culture,
within the Native American culture.
Yeah,
so
right.
You have the language of the drum, you have the language of spirit, you have herbal medicine, you have all kinds of things that are similar. And so it was the thing that they grabbed onto in order to retain their own identities, if that makes any sense.
Oh, no, it does. Absolutely. And I know we're not going to go into all of this tonight, but,
right.
But the thing is, I was thinking, we all come from Africa. So the folks who originally
Exactly.
populated this country actually came from Africa.
Yeah, so it's kind of like all coming full circle.
It is. It's true.
It's all full circle.
Yeah.
So what was present in that environment that was this more similar thing that they could understand in terms of the culture they had just been torn away from.
Yeah.
Say in the book, in the introduction, I'm like, this is a enduring bond between a people whose land was torn from them and a people torn from their own land.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, and so there was all this happening. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't Native Americans who owned, you know, there were Native Americans that owned slaves. There were black Haitians who had huge plantations and had black slaves.
Slaves as well, yeah.
So there was all this happening, and it was very complex. And when all of this was introduced together, then, of course, you know, you have this melting pot of Louisiana, and then there was all these other things that happened after that, you know, with the Plaçage movement. We talked about that briefly together the other day, with the Creole aristocracy and all of these things. So it's really complex. But the thing that's remarkable is that after 300 years, in the tricentennial year of 2018 in New Orleans, we still see Mardi Gras black masking Indians exhibiting musical characteristics, linguistic characteristics, and masquerade characteristics of West Africa.
Yeah, fascinating.
And that's what's fascinating.
The thing that's interesting is they were working as Africans were working their way through or escaping. You know, under the circumstances, it was sometimes hard to know who to trust. Is what you're saying, also.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And
So
then you
that's a
have,
challenge.
you know, if the Chittimachas have had most of their land taken from them and they become slaves,
Yeah.
but it was their land to begin with, and then you've got all these other slaves coming in from Africa, they're like, hey, come on, let's fight the oppressor.
Yeah, right. That
Let's
makes
band
sense.
together.
Right.
You know, like that's what it really became. And so there was, yes, it is a tribute to the Native Americans, but the African cultural retentions we see in the tradition itself is what I'm discussing in this book.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next term.
Sure.
Masking tradition.
I think masking traditions across the board, whether you're in Indonesia or you're in West Africa or you're in New Orleans, are indicative of, you know, trying to channel the wisdom or the energy of ancestors. And we see this in several different cultures, cross-culturally, you know, different types of specific masking ceremonies. You know, for instance, I mentioned the Egungun masquerade of Nigeria heavily in this book because I see a lot of similarities, is when you put on a masquerade and you come out to the village and you are extolling wisdom, you're actually speaking to the people in a masquerade. But the belief is that the ancestors' voices and the ancestors' spirits are coming through you to speak to the people and deliver messages. So I think based on my interviews, which is the last part of the book, that was very much true. Everybody said the same thing. They said, when we put that masquerade on, sometimes we don't even remember who we are anymore. We lose whole periods of time. We don't even remember, like, being on a certain street or doing a certain thing. And we just feel like something's different. We've been taken over.
It's such also a demonstration of just sort of understanding culture, but also the importance of the role of ancestors
Exactly.
in all of our lives, right?
Exactly. I mean, everybody in their house has a mantle place or a shelf
Yeah.
or something somewhere where they
Right.
have pictures of their ancestors. And I
Right,
think
exactly.
this whole idea of ancestor veneration is not a new one.
Yeah. All right, so another term is African cultural retention.
African cultural retention. So when we're looking at various aspects of the tradition, tradition in particular is the rhythmic things that we hear in the music. So we can break that down and pinpoint it back to, for instance, Senegal, hearing a bambula derived rhythm. So that's, you know, looking at the rhythm of the music, the linguistic characteristics. Aiko, Aiko, sure everybody heard that song growing up. That's a Mardi Gras Indian chant. It sounds a lot like, Aiko, Aiko, Ande sounds a lot like Ago, Ago, Ame. Okay? Which is, if you're in Ghana and you say Ago, hey, I'm trying to get your attention. Okay. Ame, you got my attention. Ame. So it's the very similar thing. And so you hear these linguistics retentions in the tradition. And then the masquerade itself, looking at the beadwork, the intricate beadwork and the plumage and the way that the the crown and the masquerade itself is constructed. We see very similar things in Nigeria. We see it in Mali. We see it, in different places, in West Africa. And when you look at where the slaves were actually brought from, thanks to the amazing work of Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, who was a fantastic researcher who actually broke down demographically where the slaves were brought from in Orleans Parish and around that area, we can literally look at this guy's masquerade from 2017 and say, oh, this looks just like the Wasolenke in Mali. And I've done that in the book, and I've shown that retention of the style of beadwork and the style of masquerade. So music, linguistic, even the parade itself, the procession itself. We see that Margaret Druell did wonderful work in the Yoruba tradition of procession. She talked about after someone dies and what that procession looks like and the types of things that you would hear and see, the things that would happen. And we see that playing itself out again in New Orleans when someone dies. You've got the beautiful...
Yeah, it's a celebration, isn't it?
It's a celebration.
I've been to a funeral in New Orleans as well, and I
there's
was
nothing
very
like
impressed.
that.
No, there's absolutely nothing like that. It was really quite remarkable. It was really a celebration of the individual. To me, it was. So.
I was teaching children in Indianapolis about Mardi Gras back in 2005. And we went to the African exhibit in the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and they had videos of the Ghanaian king procession coming in. And there were these big, beautiful umbrellas with the purple and the gold, and everyone's decked out in gold and purple and beautiful, brilliant colors, and it's very lively. And the little baby, who was 6 or 7, I think, looked at me and she says, "Miss Robin, it looks just like the Mardi Gras." And I said, bingo, you got it, kid. And then, it's like, that's an African cultural retention. The umbrellas, right. the beautiful procession, the way, the king's brought in, the chief's brought in, however you want to, play this out theatrically. It's still happening on the streets of New Orleans all the time.
Well, I just want our listeners to know that you are listening to WRFG-Atlanta 89.3 FM. The program is Just Peace, and I'm Heather Gray, the producer, and I'm pleased to say I'm here with Robin Ligon-Eaton, and we are talking about her remarkable book, Rhythm, Ritual, and Resistance, Africa is Alive in the Black Indians of New Orleans. Now, what I'm doing with Robin right now is going through this glossary of terms she has in her book, which is just really remarkable. I'm so appreciative of this. Before we go to the next term, however, when we were talking about African retention, Robin, you were making reference a lot to Nigeria and Senegal, but are there any other countries? Those are the two primary countries, it seems, that you make reference to as far as West Africa is concerned.
Exactly. I mean, your 3 most prevalent groups that are represented retention-wise, I think, would be Senegal for the music, then Nigeria, and then some retentions that came through Haiti and then came back up to New Orleans.
Okay. Yes. Haiti is important,
right.
Of course.
So you see that in the dress and regalia, and then you see also some Congo influences. But when I later in the book talk about this very unique spiritualist church movement and the Black Hawk Church,
right,
which is a whole other ball of wax that I got into because it just came to me, and I was able to see all the similarities. You see Congo influences too. So when you look at the veneration of deities that are in the Black Hawk Church in New Orleans, then you've got some echoes of voodoo in Congo and Dahomey and all of that kind of intertwined into it as well.
Okay, so what we've been talking about in this term is African cultural retention. I do want to mention also, I've probably mentioned this on the program before, because one of the things I've done is look at a lot of food issues.
The foodways, yeah.
And so like gumbo is a West African term, and okra is from West Africa as well. So a lot of the food we eat is actually African in origin and in spirit, I must say.
And like one of the people that I interview, one of my colleagues in the book, Ibrahim Asek, he was with the West African Research Center, and he actually kept me on the path in 2002, invited me to come over there to present the play that I wrote, Brotherhood in Congo Square.
Oh, okay.
Ibrahima just wrote a fantastic book a couple years ago called Buki Fe Gumbo, and he's from Senegal. So he talks about, again, the retentions in the foodways and the crops that were brought, and grown, and how that was all incorporated into the food in New Orleans.
You make reference, again, going back to the African cultural retention, you make reference to the Congo Square a lot. Is this where slaves were sold in New Orleans? Or where's that come from?
Congo Square was Place de Congo, and it was one of the very interesting features about slavery in New Orleans as opposed to other parts of the South and the country, was that there was a day off. So Sunday was a day. I know. Sunday was the day when all of the folks would get together in Congo Square, and they would still retain their music by playing the drums and having marketplace, and some of the Native Americans were also part of that as well. So when I wrote the play Brotherhood in Congo Square, I was really kind of talking about that as a sort of a petri dish of culture and cultural retention in New Orleans. And to this day, every Sunday, the Congo Square Preservation Society gets together, and they have drumming, live drumming and dance and cultural things going on in Congo Square. So it's still, it's right outside the French Quarter, but it's still a very spiritual and very culturally amazing and relevant place.
So this is where people would go to congregate. To
exactly. Commiserate,
okay.
to perform, to share, and continue their culture in ways that you didn't see happening in other parts of the South.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
you just didn't, it didn't exist.
Right.
And so I think today, New Orleans, I always say New Orleans is the most northern tip of Africa because Congo Square allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
That retention.
All right, let's go on to the next term, which we've already referred to somewhat, but it's cross-cultural.
Cross-cultural is big because, again, you've got this sort of merging, this collision of culture in New Orleans, like you do in other places too. But for some reason, in New Orleans, it just kind of all sort of got all, I would say diamonds are created under pressure. So you have slavery and you have all these terrible things going on, but then you have all this cross-cultural fusion of amazing things as well. Because people are going to grab onto their identity, they're going to hold onto their identities for dear life. And so, but they also do share with one another. And so cross-cultural in this sense is, yes, it's Black Indians, and there's a Native American, some of them have Native American ancestry, but essentially the African is coming through, but it is a merging of different things. Yeah.
Before we leave this term, in the reference to Black Indians, there were a number of folks who were cross-cultural in the sense that they were cross-racial as well, right?
Exactly.
Right? So there were, okay.
So they call them grifts. Like even when you look at Gwendolyn Midlow's Hall's demographic work, and you go to the Whitney Slave Plantation Museum, which is amazing. It's outside of New Orleans.
Right.
Again, Ibrahima Seck, my friend, is the principal researcher on that project.
And I want to tell the listeners that you can actually go to YouTube and find a video of this.
Of the Whitney. Yeah, the Whitney. And I went there for an entire day with Ibrahima and just the two of us. He gave me a tour, and it was, I have to tell you, it was such a heavy and incredible weight that I felt in that environment. And then to go to these huge monuments that they've set up, where they talk about specific slaves, where did they come from in Africa? Were they of cross-cultural, cross-racial identities as grifts? They call the Native and African progeny grif.
Okay.
And so they would say grif, mulatto was something completely different.
What is that? Let's talk about what is
so mulatto. Mulatto was usually a person of African and European descent.
I see.
A grif was a person of African and Native American descent.
I see. Okay.
A Creole is a person of African, aristocratic French or Spanish descent from Spain or France, and then Native American was thrown in there quite a lot. Okay. So you've got all three of those things at play at one time. So the Creole, my daughter, for instance, is Creole because she has Choctaw, Chickasaw, Miami from my side, and Cherokee, African, French, aristocratic, She's got all of that. So she is considered Creole. And
So-
she was born in New Orleans.
So your background is what?
My background is French and Native American.
I see. Okay.
Right.
Right.
Miami, the Miamis of Indiana.
I see.
So there was and some of the Miamis are still there, but it's only the Miamis that were allowed to remain and were not thrown away hither and yon to Oklahoma or out to Ohio or Michigan. The only Miamis that remained were the ones that were related to Frances Slocum, who was a white woman. So they had Caucasian and Native American,
Okay.
cross-cultural, cross-racial.
Well, we've already talked about this a little bit, but here we have the next term in the glossary is maroon.
Oh, the Maroons were the ones who got away. And the Maroons were the ones who were brave enough to not even deal with the Native Americans necessarily, but just be independently runaway slaves, but then they actually rose up. So I talk about that with Juan St. Malo, who was a very famous Maroon slave who had Maroon camps outside of New Orleans.
Okay.
In fact, they would rise up from time to time and, have these terrible, he was known to be quite a murderer and a slaughterer. But, again, fighting against the oppressor. So that's what it was all about. And it's interesting because there was a lot of folklore around Juan St. Malo as well. And so when Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo queen of New Orleans, became prominent, she actually grabbed onto Juan St. Malo, and they made him Saint Maroon. So he was venerated as one who was fought the oppressor and was
I see.
an icon.
That's how you're.
An icon of resistance, even within the voodoo culture of New Orleans.
Well, actually, he was the next one on the list, Juan Samalo.
Right. So we talk about Maroon slaves.
What years are we talking about here?
It's like 1700s, yeah.
In the 1700s.
Yeah, mid to late. But that this still existed. His legacy still carried on, even though there was not anybody who was quite as prominent of an icon of resistance after that. But they were fearless, and he was even fearless to the point where they hung him in Jackson Square in the middle of the French Quarter. So
interesting.
yeah, to make an example.
Yeah. So the next term is Black Hawk.
Black Hawk was an Indian warrior. He was a Sauk Indian warrior in Illinois. But interestingly enough, again, another icon of resistance. There was a lady named Leafy Anderson, and she decided to kind of import Black Hawk, the idea of Black Hawk. She came down to New Orleans in the 1920s, and she said, we're going to incorporate this into the spiritualist church. And so they said, well, he's the one who gets things done. Then we really start seeing some things that look like voodoo, that look like Yoruba cultural retention. The deities. We see the colors on Black Hawk on the altar of the church. You've got an effigy of Indian warrior sitting on an altar of the church. And I have pictures of this from the Historic New Orleans collection in my book. And I said, well, wait, hold up a second. There's got to be a relationship here that, again, solidified this whole idea of being a Mardi Gras Indian, but also being an icon of resistance.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so they felt like the spirit of Black Hawk was coming down to protect. And these are black churches in New Orleans, the spiritualist tradition, but again looking to an Indian warrior as the icon of resistance.
Yeah.
Right? So it just really brings it on home. If you walked into a Black Hawk church, you would see a picture of Martin Luther King next to Black Hawk, next to St. Michael, which is Catholic.
Right.
And then you might see what they would talk about. They put the head of Black Hawk in a bucket behind the door. Traditionally, in the Yoruba tradition, you've got a Shu, which is the master of the crossroads, a keeper of all fate, but you'd put him next to your door for protection.
I see.
Okay? And then it also aspects with Ogun, which is the god of war and also a protector. You'd have a bucket with all of his implements in it. and with maybe something that represents Ogun. So you've got all of this, again, cross-cultural,
Wow.
African, Catholic, syncretic things going on. You've got so many things that you're dealing with. And then in Kisi, which is something that you find at the head of the village in the Congo. Again, I don't know if you've ever seen those things like in an African collection of art, an effigy that has all these nails driven into it.
Yes.
Yeah,
right.
so that's to absorb all of the things the harm that might be coming to the village. That's a protector.
I see.
So I talk about in Kisi, in Congo there, Robert Ferris Thompson, who is a fantastic person in this respect, who did a lot of research on Congo influences and retentions, talks extensively about in Kisi. And so I've talked about that as well. But yeah, it's all in there.
We're going to have to take a quick break, but I just want you to know, Robin, I'm just looking at a message I just received here from Sean Jones. He says, I'm loving this guest and your discussion with her. I've been to the Whitney Plantation Museum 3 times. It's awesome. I've been to the Congo Square as well. Awesome.
Oh, cool. It really is worth a trip down there because you're gonna discover so much richness in what is there.
Well, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned. Again, my name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace, and I'm here with Robin Ligon-Eaton, and we're talking about, I'm going to repeat again, this book that she has come out with recently called Rhythm, Ritual, and Resistance, Africa is Alive in the Black Indians of New Orleans. So I'm going to have Robin back in here again. We need to have much more discussion about all of this, but what I'm doing with her right now is going through the glossary of terms that she has in her book, which just explains so much. So another term here is Egungun masquerade?
Egungun, the Egungun.
Yeah, I pronounced it correctly. Okay, good.
And the Egungun is a function or a tradition that comes from Ifa in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And so Egungun are the ancestor spirits. And so the Eguns, they come, and part of the masquerade is you put on this very elaborate, sometimes it's beaded, there's all these different sections to it. It's very colorful, and you completely covered in your face. You can't see anyone with the masquerade on, but they come out to the village to basically extol wisdom and to give guidance to the people in the village presumably from ancestors, that the ancestors are coming through them and speaking to the village. And so when I did all of the interviews with the chiefs and the tribal members of the Black Indians in New Orleans, they all told me the same thing. They all said, we put the masquerade on, we feel like something else is happening. We're don't even feel like ourselves anymore. We feel like we don't even remember what we say. It's almost like nobody said possessed, but that's what they meant, that they were the catching spirit, that they had some other kind of force, some other kind of energy coming through them. And I said, well, that's normal. They said, oh, really? I said, yeah, it's been happening for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I said, again, that's another African cultural retention. So, I kind of feel like ancestors, from what I've been able to see when I'm out on the streets with the Mardi Gras Indians, you can tell, like if you've ever seen a spirit possession in Haiti or you've seen those kinds of things happen, you can tell that they're not exactly themselves. I remember when I was working with a Mardi Gras Indian chief, and he looked like his eyes were vacant, like he was like something else was going on there, and so it was interesting.
Yeah. Let me just ask you, we're talking a lot about Mardi Gras, but are these masks and these ceremonies taking place at other times also? Yes.
St. Joseph's Night, which is an Italian Catholic tradition in March. It's around the same time as the celebration of St. Patrick's Day. So it's always like that Sunday around St. Patrick's Day. The Indians come out again as well. And that's also an extension of what happens with the spiritualist church too. So, it's all kind of tied together.
Well, in their communities, though, are they doing this as well? I mean,
they're doing, yeah.
Even informally sometimes, are they?
Informally, and there's a lot more, happening because there's such a demand for the Mardi Gras Indians. They're so well loved and so well respected in their neighborhoods. So they come out and they do a lot of things in the community. for instance, in the Upper Ninth Ward, Big Chief Donald Harrison, his legacy has been carried on. He died a couple of years ago, but his wife and his daughter have taken care of his legacy and making sure that all the children in the neighborhood have had books to read. There's a museum that they've built to educate the younger generation about this amazing tradition.
Okay. All right. So another term is Senegambian slaves.
There were a lot of slaves. I think 6,000 were brought specifically from that region of Africa. And
it's really Senegal and Gambia, right? Is what we're talking
Senegal
about
and Gambia,
here.
yeah. And so in that area of Africa, 6,000 came. You see this at the Whitney, too, the Whitney plantation. Ibrahim has done a very good job of outlining all of the things that were happening.
And where is Ibrahim from? Where's he from?
He's from Senegal. He's from Dakar.
From Senegal, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm sorry.
He's from
ahead.
Dakar.
Yeah.
And I met him on a plane going to New Orleans in 2002. And I don't know what, maybe something came over me because we simply had this amazing, I started speaking to him in French. And how did I know he was from Senegal? And then I called him Samba. And he says, he stopped and he says, that's what I was called as a child. That was my
really?
childhood
Oh, my
name.
goodness.
And we just had this amazing connection with one another. And then I sent him the play that I wrote, Brotherhood in Congo Square.
Okay.
And he was so impressed with the initial research. He says, you have to come to Senegal.
Yeah,
but we couldn't
right.
get the visas at the time to bring the people over that we wanted to
Okay.
create the production. So it didn't happen. But the fact that he even invited me was, a great thing. Because
that's an honor.
it told me
Yeah,
it was
right.
I was on the right track.
Right, exactly. Let's go to another one of these terms, limitations of the study.
Well, the limitation of the study was how many people was I interviewing and how was I interviewing them and what can you glean from all of the information that's being given to you, whether you're reading it in a book or talking to one of the chiefs or tribal members or curators of, the culture. So there's only so much that you can do. But I think now I realized, even after 20 years of looking at this, that I've just scratched the surface on it. It is so complex and there's so much depth to it that I could probably spend another 20, 30 years really fleshing all of this out.
Well, so the very last term you have, which is interesting, is assumptions. So why did you put that in there in this glossary of terms? Did you have certain assumptions, or did other people have certain assumptions? Or,
I had assumptions, and at the beginning, as a person of Native American heritage, I thought that this was really something that was much more of a Native American culture, and what I assumed was that was the case. But then afterwards, I found that the African traditions retained were really much more of the influence.
Right.
So,
Interesting.
and then, also, it's always been a secret society, Mardi Gras Indian or Black Indian culture. It's always been like being a Mason or something. Like you don't really know what's going on with it. I mean, you don't know any of these things. It's passed on down by oral tradition, by example, over generation to generation to generation. So they're not going to just let people in to study it.
Right.
Okay.
So I knew our time would go quickly, Robin. It's just gone so quickly. We don't have much time left here. There's so much to talk about. But as I want those of you listening out there, Robin will be coming back. We're going to continue with this discussion. I do want to talk just quickly, just for a couple of minutes here, about the uniqueness of this blend of cultures in the New Orleans area or in Louisiana, where we have the African, the Native American, the European, the Haitians. It's unique.
And Caribbean,
It's in the Caribbean altogether. It's unique in this country. Am I right? It really is.
It's a cradle. And if you look at a lot of popular music that started coming out, in the 40s and 50s, a lot of it was coming out of New Orleans. And I think it was because of the synthesis of cultures and this rhythm, this character, this Africanness, also with jazz, of course, and Jelly Roll Morton. He was actually a Mardi Gras Indian. He talks about this with Alan Lomax and some archival recording. So he talks about his his own role as a spy boy in a Black Indian gang. So it's just amazing to see the depth and breadth and just the joy, really, and the beauty of this culture. And I can't even begin to, again, scratch the surface or explain it to us. You have to get online and you have to start doing some research, or go to Talking Eagle Press at bigcartel.com and get my book. And then you can at least have a little guidebook to start your journey on learning about it.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Robin, I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed this evening.
Thank you.
It's just sort
I've enjoyed it too.
You're just full of so much fascinating information. And, the Southern culture is so incredibly unique in so many ways, and certainly the African influence on who we are in the South. I mean, what has made this culture. And I do want, so you're going to come back, right?
Thank you.
We're going to have this
Thank you. I would love it.
And then we will also open up the phone lines. I know all of you all listening out there will have tons of questions to ask
I'd love to talk to
Robin,
people about it.
That would be fun as well. So we will definitely do that. I'm going to play just a little bit of music, and I'm going to ask everyone to stay tuned for Revolutionary African Perspectives. And tonight we have been talking with Robin Ligon-Eaton. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes.
Okay, good. And thank you so much, Robin.
Thank you
This is
so
great.
much. It's been a pleasure.